For the artists, for the passionate. Welcome to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Alright, hello everyone and welcome back to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. I am your host, Jade Black, and today I'm talking about books within my writing, or alternatively, bookception, because that sounds cool. If you can hear any background noise, that's just because it's hot today, like stupid hot, especially for September when I'm recording this. So the window is open, all being well. You won't hear anything though, because when I recorded in a storm you didn't hear that, so that was pretty neat. So in terms of what I'm covering this episode, I'm sort of talking about types of books, be that genre and other things about that, library infrastructure and publishing houses, and also which nations are unique, who likes to read, who likes to write, all of that sort of stuff. So let's jump on into this, and let's start with what's popular in the world of the determined ones. And this does vary a bit by nation, of course, but sort of across the continent, noir is probably the top selling genre, or definitely one of them. It's top two, I would say. Noir is one of those things that's a slightly more recent innovation, mainly in Hukai and in Haraith. There is a bit coming out of South Yordavik as well. Those are the sort of main two though. And it's really taken the continent by storm, because it's a sort of genre of thriller. It's very similar to thriller, but often that bit sort of darker, but in a quiet way. And a lot of people, particularly up north, seem to really, really enjoy the sort of quiet darkness of noir. Maybe that's it. I suspect, particularly in Hukai, it sort of hits home a little bit with the sort of quiet darkness of how the war was for a lot of people in the south who were less affected by it directly. And in Haraith, they're just all fucking miserable, so, it makes sense. Really put it like that, huh? Another really well-selling genre is also horror, which isn't really that much of a surprise. A lot of horror in that world has a basis in mythology, be that Malasound myth is like the famous mythology. There is some around Canaan myth as well that's quite interesting, and if you have a fear of big expanses of water, you will be suitably terrified, because Canaan myth, for what it's worth, all surrounds merfolk and all of that, and it would be interesting to touch on mythology in an episode. Maybe let me know what you think about that. But I think probably the top selling genre, the other one of the top two at least, would be romance, because, it's a crowd pleaser in our world and in theirs. People like to escape to something that's a bit lower stakes and a bit calmer and often a bit just nicer than what a lot of people have to deal with. I'm going to talk a little bit about new and niche genres as well, because there are a few of those popping up within the timeline of the determined ones that are very new. In fantasy and sci-fi, fantasy is one of those things that during Imperial times just kind of didn't really exist much. I suspect there was a fair bit of supernatural stuff, but straight up fantasy and Imperial times, I can't see being a thing really at all. I mean, there might have been the odd small thing from like a short story, but in terms of big epic fantasy novels, no. That's also pretty exclusive to Malasound, which is probably also because of Malasound myth. there's a big basis. There's a lot of talk about Malazan myth really across the continent. A lot of people just find it interesting, but because it's sort of kind of entrenched in Malazan culture, so spinning that into fantasy and then it sort of spirals out of control and turns into like epic nonsense. Epic nonsense. Me, 2023. Anyhow, that is mostly a Malazan thing. I suspect it does have some traction in Cana and elsewhere, but it's not written much outside of Malazan. And sci-fi isn't either, because, well, there isn't really much to go off, as much as anything else. I mean, they don't have clocks yet, so there's not a lot. Again, this is pretty exclusive to Malazan just because their medical technology, compared to everybody else, is just streets ahead. Like, they're really, really good medically. And that's sort of where a lot of the sci-fi stuff has sort of started from. A lot of that is sort of sci-fi medical thriller, I guess, probably. It's not really something I know a lot about because I don't have characters that read it much. I suspect there is also bits of sci-fi that touches on other areas of life as well. I'm sure there is, but again, it's something that I don't know a lot about in context yet. A very niche genre, and this is partly because of book banning and book restrictions as much as anything else, is erotica. It's not something that's published in most nations, it's not necessarily something that's written much in most nations, just because it's kept on the down low basically everywhere except Qui and John. Because they're open to it there. And some other nations would be as well. I suspect it would go down very well in Malazan if more people knew about it as much as anything else. It's one of those things that's sort of restricted because of basically religious puritanism. We love that. And a lot of other people just are kind of uncomfortable with the idea of reading about other people's sex. I mean, Ai Nagashima is actually one of those where he doesn't like reading books with lots of sex in it. For some reason, there's probably a religious hang-up for him. It makes him kind of uncomfortable. If it's characters he likes or cares about, or he'll hate me for saying this, has a bit of a thing for, then he'll read it. But if it's like a side character or anything, he probably just won't. He'll probably just skip over the scene. Let's talk a little bit about libraries and publishing houses, and I do have some concept art on screen here of the National Library of Yukai, which is a building I wish I could properly visit, which has the ground floor of it is all Yuki's legal and academic books, and then the upper two floors are sort of Yuki's fiction. Now some rare books at the top, and in the basement you have foreign books, be that legal texts and academic works and things like that, but there is also foreign fiction in that library. And there are libraries all over Yukai, and a lot of libraries in a lot of nations, really. Books are pretty big business out there. And the Yuki's library scheme is something I want to talk about real quick, because you can join that, and that effectively just lets you use any library in Yukai for free. Like, it's a really, really good scheme, and most Yuki's libraries do also have food and drink available for free for people who need it as well, or people who just want to have a cup of tea while they read a book, and it's very nice. Another particular library I want to talk about, and I don't have concept art for this, sadly, it is something I've thought about doing, and probably will in future, is the Malazan Royal Library, which is in Amir Castle. And that just has, I mean, honestly, probably nudging 1 million books, if not more, in it. And that is almost all fiction. There is, like, some local lore stuff in there for people that need it, but it is almost entirely fiction, and that's just free for castle staff and the public. There are public opening hours for, just citizens of the nation, but if you are castle staff, you can go in there basically any time. I don't know if you can borrow books if there aren't librarians there, probably not, but there are plenty of cozy little nooks and things to sit in, so it's all good. There are also private libraries within Amir Castle that the royals have available to them, that they can buy books and just fill those up as is, or stuff like that. It's not generally the books they have in private collections. There will be a copy in the main royal library, but they might want their own copy, or they might have their own copy first and then say, actually, no, we should have this in the royal library. Or just sometimes they want to read in peace. Things like that. There is also, it's not strictly a library, well, it's not. There is also the Malazan Royal Archive, which is, size-wise, probably rivaling the Royal Library, of diaries and accounts and all sorts of stuff about the Malazan royals, mostly, but there's also a lot in there about imperial history. Because a lot of... How do I do this without spoilers? Give me a moment. A lot of knowledge was entrusted to the Malazans at the end of the downfall. Because one thing that is, I think, a little bit of a misconception in world, as much as anything, about the downfall is that happened super quick. That was like a day or a week or something. The downfall took years. Like, there were people who were born at the start of the downfall and who lived through it and remember bits of it because they weren't necessarily too young to remember living through it. So towards the end, a lot of knowledge was entrusted to Malazan, and it's still there. Most of it hasn't been touched or really looked at all. It was just sort of put there for safekeeping, like right at the back somewhere. And as much as anything, it hasn't really been touched because it's all in Hukies. And there are probably characters and things that are antiquated that nobody quite knows the meaning of anymore, as much as anything else. And, you know, people in Malazan don't speak Hukies. There's the odd person that does, so the royals often do, just because, you know, diplomatic roles, it's useful to know the language of the people you're talking to. And Danath is an exception. He does also speak Hukies fluently, but everybody else, no. So let's talk a little bit about publishing houses, because publishing houses, this isn't something I know a great deal amount, because I don't have any characters yet who are proper serious writers full-time. But publishing is a really big business, because, you know, people like to read when on their days off and in the evenings and things like that. Not everybody's an artist, not everybody plays music. A lot of people do just read for enjoyment. And so publishing houses, they often do specialise in things. There'll be publishing houses that only publish, you know, memoirs and non-fiction, and publishing houses that specialise in academic or legal work, but also specialise, I can talk, by genre, so be that fantasy or thriller and noir, or I suspect there are some that sort of just kind of do everything, like, hey, if it's cool, bring it, like me with interviews. That was a nice ugly plug. But yeah. And probably publishing houses that specialise in anthologies and kidlit and stuff like that too. And publishing houses will have stalls in marketplaces as well, where they just have new release books, bestsellers. Sometimes they'll have slow sellers that they're trying to pick up. And there's a lot of merchandising around publishing houses as well. So there'll be pre-order bonuses and stuff like that, so you can get limited edition artwork or bookmarks or other related things. You can often get little badges or like pins, depending on what word you use for that are related to a book series or maybe even a publishing house and things like that. And this is actually something that inspires Hanzo in Snakebite. because he's a huge reader, he is. And one of the things he does when he's first running for mayor, or it might be the second time, but I'm pretty sure he at least considers it the first time, is he sees all this merchandising from publishing house and thinks, I could do that. I could make, little badges that say Votoyama on them, and he does. And it actually wins him an election, stuff like that, because word of mouth is a huge deal. It's not something that's been done in politics before. And I thought that was neat. So let's talk a little bit more about nations that have an exception and book banning and things like that. I'm not going to cover Malazan because I basically already have, in terms of, they have fantasy and sci-fi there and a massive royal library. Let's talk a little bit more about Quianzhong, because I did mention before that they're more open to erotica than anywhere else. That's where most of it's written and published. That's kind of their niche in the market as much as anything else. And a lot of nations don't like to import it, but it can be done on the down low. You can just request foreign books from a foreign publisher if you get in touch with them via, the post. You can just write a letter to a publisher and say, hey, I can't find this book anywhere. Could you send me a copy? Obviously I'll pay for it, but, you could just include the price there and then if you wanted. And that's a way of doing things. Self-publishing, I don't know how much of a thing that is. I'm sure it is done, but it's genuinely just something I don't really know about. But Quianzhong do a huge trade in that, and Hanzo is a big proponent of that literature. He's notorious for it within the library sector, oh yes, the Quianzhongan section, that's where he is. A man has his needs, I guess. And let's talk about Liera next, because Liera are terrible for book banning. They're really, really bad for it. They don't like certain genres, so erotica, absolutely not. They don't really like fantasy that much either, probably because it goes against their church as much as anything else. Liera is pretty staunchly religious, as you can already tell. But they also have massive restrictions on Yuki's books because they don't like the Yukis, and Soleil are the same on that one. But one thing Liera have done that's genuinely just a really shitty thing to do is they have, effectively they drafted the Downfall Agreement, which was the sort of peace treaty-ish that prevented the Yukis from being, completely genocided. Genocided. Not sure that's a word, but you get the point. And within the Downfall Agreement, there are all kinds of weird clauses in there, but there are clauses about imperial history books and restrictions on, the writing, publishing, and sale of those, especially in Yukai. And really, they're supposed to be destroyed if they're found. Not that anybody in Yukai actually does that, at least anymore. But the key thing to note is that not every nation is subject to the Downfall Agreement. This is something that is placed pretty much exclusively on Yukai and Liera. Malazan are notably exempt. And this is why knowledge was entrusted to them, because it's like, well, if you find it there, tough shit. There's not anything you can do about it. Safjordovic are also really bad for book banning. They have a lot of restrictions on Yuki's books, and they do meddle with publishers a fair bit as well, and they try and edit certain things out that either don't paint Safjordovic in a good light, or they just think it's sort of bad propaganda, effectively. And this is something that they do with foreign books as well, is they sort of import them and then quietly republish them after editing out things they don't like. And it's pretty rare that the original author or publisher is aware of this. So let's talk about some bookish characters, because I did mention Hanzo briefly earlier, and the sort of things he likes to read. He does also like to read things like noir as well. He does enjoy darker literature. Probably not horror, I think that might be a bridge too far for him. Anything medical thrillery he would stay well the fuck away from. No, he doesn't want to go anywhere near that. He has, basically his entire house, like any available wall that he can get away with has a bookshelf on it. He has a lot of books. He likes to buy his own books as opposed to borrowing them from the library most of the time to support artists and writers and things like that, because he does dabble in the arts a bit himself, but both his siblings are actually artists. His younger sister, Wakane, is a cartoonist, that's her job. His brother is a glassblower, so he does some sort of art, ornamenty vases and stuff like that, but he does also do more commercial products too, so. But they are both artistically minded, and he values the arts, as do most people across the continent, but particularly in Hukai, the arts are a big deal. He has at least one bookcase dedicated to his TBR pile, and he also has a list, and that is mentioned on page towards the end, well, at the very end of Snakebite, actually. Let's go back to I as well, because I did touch on him earlier with he doesn't like to read sex scenes very much. I think he just gets uncomfortable. He likes his thrillers, but I can feel his glare burning into the side of my head as I say this. He's a romance reader. He does. He loves it. Like, as in, when we say romance, like, the sappiest, most, like, probably cringeworthy romance you can find, especially if it's, like, spy romance. He loves that shit. He will eat it up all day long. He probably likes a fair bit of crime as well, but romance is his thing. He just wants to read about happy things, I guess. He does have a particular hatred for fantasy. I'm not really sure why. He just doesn't find it. I guess he doesn't suspend his disbelief very well for fantasy. And I think he also doesn't like books that are too long. He's very much I want to read this in a day or two and be done. Curtis is kind of the opposite. Curtis wants the biggest tome of lore you can find. He wants to read. He's really interested in mythology. He's a bit of a mythology dork, to be honest, and he does love a lot of Malazan fantasy because of it, because it's like, ooh, mythology, I can be a nerd. He probably says it exactly like that too. No, he doesn't. He has a French accent, what we would call a French accent, and I'm not gonna do that today. You don't need to be subject to that. You've already been subjected to enough accents just listening to me talk. But yeah, Curtis wants big books, he wants fantasy, I imagine he probably likes sci-fi as well, because he's interested in the medicine side of things. He probably likes a lot of action stuff as well. Basically, the bigger the better. If it's a big book, he probably likes it. If it's standard length, as in, 75k, that's actually standard length, he's probably just going to find that a bit unsatisfying. And last but not least, I'm going to touch on characters who write, and there's a slightly tenuous link here with Isamu because he's more of a songwriter than anything else, but he does write lyrics as well, and I imagine he probably has dabbled in things like micro and flash fiction a bit. I just can't see that he hasn't a few times over the years, but in terms of writing lyrics, it's not something he does often. He can sing, and he is very good at it. He does have, I've often thought of his voice as being, oh my god, what is his name? Somewhat similar to both Johnny Hartman and Frank Sinatra, somewhere like that. His voice sung is significantly lower than his speaking voice, as is true for many singers. It's pretty rare, actually, that people singing and speaking voices in the same register. But yeah, he doesn't really write lyrics very often. He's more, he's a guitarist. He does the music side of things when he writes songs more than anything. The one serious writer I do have, and he's not a POV character in the Determined Ones, is a guy, I'm not entirely sure how to say his name, but I'm going to give it a go. Womo. He writes sort of supernatural ghost stories, that sort of thing. I have a feeling some of them might be for kids, but like the vast majority are just really dark and is in a what the fuck did I just read sort of a way. He gets a lot out of writing. He is an ex-soldier, so trauma. And writing helps him deal with that, and also helps him understand the world a bit and understand his beliefs a bit more. And he's a very interesting man who I can't wait to talk to a bit more, because I have written some shorts and micros from his POV, and he's very, very interesting to me. His voice, for what it's worth, this is really random, but it sounds to me, I imagine, a little bit like Leonard Cohen, but like Leonard Cohen as an old man. As in sort of Popular Problems sort of era. If you don't know Leonard Cohen's Popular Problems, by the way, I recommend a listen. It's a very good album. I want to go back, before I end the episode, to shorts and microfiction and poetry and anthologies and things like that. It's not something I know tons about, but I do know that short story collections and anthologies there are publishing houses that do specialise in that, and they are popular as well, because a lot of people really like those short reads that they can just, pick it up, put it down, pick it up, put it down. Haiku and poetry and things like that, I suspect are less popular. Hyukai, I imagine, does do well for haiku in the north, maybe not so much in the south. Poetry I can see as being a very Herithian, so generally probably more west side. No, east side of the continent. I know my own map, I promise. But I think that is probably about all I have to say. But if you are a writer, if you have a book that you want to talk about on this podcast, please do get in touch if you're published or on the way. It doesn't have to be new, it doesn't have to be out yet, it can be anything in between. I don't care. If it's cool, bring it in. Doesn't have to be a novel, doesn't really have to be adult, doesn't have to be anything. It can be whatever. If you want to do an overview episode on a trilogy, sure. Overview episode on a series, depending on length, I imagine would be a bit harder to do. I'd rather talk about the books individually. It would get you a bit more marketing as well, so. But we can talk about all that via email, please. jade42black@gmail.com. There is a list of stuff I want to know in the description below. Please read that first so that I don't have to give out automatic no's if and when I get inundated. If you want to find me elsewhere, or the podcast home, which is probably what you're looking for more than anything, the podcast home is Instagram, Jade_Black21 on there. On Instagram, you will find advance notice of what the next episode will be, and you will also find soundbite teaser reels. Some will go out before the episode goes live, some after, depending on all kinds of things. So make sure you check that out if you're really enjoying the podcast, and also subscribe please, that'd be nice. If you want to know more about my writing and stuff like that, then Twitter is the place to be, JadeBlack21. If you're more interested in art stuff, obviously I've got concept art on the side here, and I do post art more on Blue Sky than anywhere else, JadeBlack21. If there are major announcements for what it's worth, such as new podcast episodes or big writing news, big art news, or anything. You're not going to miss out on that by not following me on a particular platform. Don't feel you have to. If you're not interested in a particular facet of what I do, that's fine. I genuinely do not give a crap. I would rather you spend your time enjoying yourself rather than hate watching Marvel or whatever, I don't know. But for now, this is about the end, so you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing so you don't miss future content. Copyright J Blank 2023.